Hi, I'm Susan Swain, host of C-SPAN's Q&A. Before this week's program, I want to take just a minute to tell you about a timely episode of our Presidential Recordings podcast on the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You'll hear actual phone calls between President John F. Kennedy and his advisors, press conferences, and an interview with presidential historian Barbara Perry of the University of Virginia Miller Center. You can find this bonus episode of Presidential Recordings wherever you listen to podcasts. In this episode, you'll meet civil rights legal scholar Margaret Burnham. In 2007, she launched Northeastern University's Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project to document the largely unknown Black victims of racial violence in the South in the 1930s through the 1950s. In her new book, By Hands Now Known, Professor Burnham describes the legal system's inherent support of Jim Crow violence. And you'll hear stories of the more than 1,000 now documented murders in which the perpetrators were never brought to justice. Legal scholar and author Margaret Burnham, your new book is called By Hands Now Known. This book really is the public tip of an iceberg of a project you initiated back in 2007. Will you tell me about that project?
Yes, in 2007, along with many of my students and colleagues at Northeastern University School of Law, we began looking at homicides from the Jim Crow era. We first started looking at a later period. We first started looking at the 1960s, but we then realized that most of those cases were fairly well known or easily discoverable. But we found that there was this black hole for cases of an earlier period, 1930s and 1940s. So we began to concentrate on that era, looking to see what patterns we could discern, but most importantly, looking to figure out how we could help the families, the survivors of this violence, who many of whom were and are still alive. So the sons and daughters of those who had been killed during this period, we were working with them to reconstruct what had actually occurred and to give them some sense of or some knowledge about what had happened to their loved ones. You bookended the years 1933 and 1954 for your research. Why are those the appropriate years? So we start in 1930 and we go to 1954. As I mentioned a moment ago, the period late from 1954 Brown and Board forward, we really have the civil rights movement in its bloom, and we have a far better sense of what's going on in the South. We started in 1930 because there were two other scholars who had worked from the Reconstruction period through 1930 to document pretty much the same thing. Their archive focuses on lynching from the period late 19th century through 1930. So we picked up in 1930 to bookend their project and only carried through to 1954. Obviously, there's much more work to be done, but as a scholar, one has to bracket. One has to have a beginning and an end, as it were, and that's what it was for us. All of your work so far is collected in an online archive that's accessible to the public. What will you find there? Well, first of all, the archive is crjarchive.org, and I'm urging everyone to go and look for themselves. We have in the archive 1,000 cases of Jim Crow era killings. These are from the Confederate states, the 11 states of the former Confederacy. And obviously, we've done as much as we can to collect the records, the DOJ records, the FBI records, the local government records, the coroner's reports, the death certificates, and the family memories, all in one place. So for some of these cases are obviously more built out than others, but for every case, you can plug in a name and find out what happened, or find out what records are available on this particular case. So we also have collected newspaper articles. Some are accurate, some are not so accurate, but the archive will give you a full sense of what the violence looked like, and not only what the violence looked like, but also what the resistance looked like. So the archive also just focuses on how communities, African Americans and others in those communities, came together to fight back and to survive these events.
It's been a lot of years. Are any of the cases you uncovered still prosecutable?
No, I don't think so. These are in these cases, the perpetrators are mostly dead. There may be one or two where very, very old, mostly men here. We're talking about the lethality of men, where these men are still alive. But for the most part, these cases have been unearthed for what they tell us about the period, and also to help the family members understand their own histories.
So what, in the largest sense, is the story that your work has uncovered?
We have been able to show that the lynching cases, dramatic and brutal though they are, and also uniquely American phenomenon that it is, really doesn't fully describe the everyday routine violence that African Americans faced in the Jim Crow South. And we're not arguing that this was exclusively a Southern phenomenon, but we are focusing on the South because that's where the violence was concentrated. And also that's where folks were disenfranchised. So they had no real ability to affect their political realities, their political and juridical realities, because they had no jurors, they had no judges, they had no sheriffs, they had no police officers. So they were exposed, completely exposed, not only to the violence at the hands of law enforcement and also at the hands of bus drivers and others in positions of authority who felt their role was to enforce Jim Crow norms. And because they couldn't protect themselves from this violence, obviously, as I say, what arises is a very robust liberatory resistance movement that is the movement that carries us into the more well-known civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s.
In the introduction, you acknowledged that for young people today, this seems like ancient history, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. Why do you think it's important to hear these stories?
Well, the stories are critically important because they are the precursor to what occurs later on. So you really can't understand what many have called the new Jim Crow, the systemic and structural features of our justice system that have left so many African Americans exposed to, widespread injustice. You can't understand that phenomena described so well by Michelle Alexander in her book unless you really get a sense of what the old Jim Crow was. And so what we try, and you also can't understand, we all owe a debt to the movements that have come before us. So those who are engaged in movements for a wider justice today, Black Lives Matter folks who are working around disability issues, the feminist movements, all of these movements are indebted to the work done by earlier organizers and earlier struggles for justice and for a wider democracy in our country. So that's the story that we wanted to. We tell the story of the violence, but as I say, it's also the resistance.
So if the story of this is that violence was necessary to sustain Jim Crow, and especially across the southern states, and there was no recourse at the local level or state level for many of the citizens subjected to this violence, then what about the federal government? In the 30s, 40s, up to the 50s, that is the predominantly FDR era, leading into Harry Truman era. Where was the federal government in this?
The federal government could have, but did not provide a backstop for the violence. The tools were, I argue that the tools were imperfect, but they were there. So coming out of the Reconstruction period, a whole set of laws were adopted, including laws intended to address the racial violence that was then being perpetrated in response to the end of slavery. And so there were these two statutes that could have been deployed by the federal government to tamp down on local violence, both by state actors, by sheriffs and police chiefs, but also by conspirators like the KKK and others. These laws were not really put into force until the 1940s. There were a couple of cases before that, but it's not until 1939 that the Justice Department creates a unit intended to address racial violence. And even then, their efforts on this front were ineffectual, in part because they were tied to local communities for investigation. So the lawyers in Washington had to look to lawyers in the southern jurisdictions to investigate these cases, not just to lawyers, but also to the FBI, the local FBI. And these people were embedded in their communities. They were all white, of course, and deeply embedded in their communities and hostile to the prosecution of these cases. So that was one factor. Inadequate laws, difficulty working through the southern jurisdictional legal system, federal legal systems in the South. And the other is jurors. So we're talking about all white, mostly male jurors during this period of time. And they would repeatedly, with rare exceptions, watch these cases, even when the killings were just so obvious. The evidence was hitting you in the face, and nevertheless, the jurors would return and slap down these prosecutors time and time again, both federal and a few state prosecutors. And so, no prosecutor wants to enter a courtroom with a case that is solid, that is going to be rejected, that he knows will be rejected by a jury. So, those are the three central reasons why federal support for the effort to control the violence in the South was unavailing. Let me just add one fourth thing, and that is to say that when the civil rights statutes were adopted in the 1960s, even then, there was an effort on the part of John Lewis and others to get the statutes to include remedies for racial violence, and it didn't happen. We got a Voting Rights Act, we got a Housing Act, we got a Public Accommodations Act, we got an employment, a Title VII, the employment bill, but we got nothing from the federal government that would address and redress this violence. And in part, that's obviously what's going, because of the strength of the Southern constituency in Congress, but it's also because because the parties are not interested in raising the ire of Southern politicians.
While we're talking about presidential administrations, you report in the book that, in fact, after Harry Truman initiated his civil rights agenda, there was, in fact, a steep rise in anti-Black crimes.
There was. So Harry Truman comes along in 1948, and he creates a commission to investigate. He first of all desegregates the Army, famously desegregates the Army, and then creates a commission to investigate these cases. And the commission begins to hold hearings in the South. One case out of Mobile, Alabama, I think is exemplary of what happened. This man gets on a bus. He's coming from his base. It's 1948. He's coming from a base where he works. It's 1948. He's traveling with a white worker, a fellow worker, and he says something. He asks the guy, "Can we have a beer?" And the guy says, "No, I don't drink with black folk." And the victim says, "Well, Harry Truman's going to fix all that." And he gets off the bus, and the white fellow worker follows him and kills him right there at the bus stop. So that's an extreme case, obviously. But just all across the country, there's this spike, and we see it in Birmingham as well. We're able to trace police killings in Birmingham, and there's this dramatic spike in 1948 as the national government begins to begin to recognize these issues in the South.
The Supreme Court has an important role in the story that you tell, sometimes in reinforcing Jim Crow and sometimes remedying it. Tell me about the importance of the Cruikshank ruling that set the stage for Jim Crow violence.
So Cruikshank is a case coming out of Louisiana in the 19th century, late 19th century, and it involved really a slaughter of African Americans who are mobilizing to participate electorally, slaughtered by white Democrats. These were Black Republicans being slaughtered by a group of white Democrats at the courthouse in Louisiana. And the case that emerges is one brought by the federal government against the killers. Cruikshank is the name of one of the killers. And these people are prosecuted. Some are convicted. The case reaches the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court reverses the convictions. And the reasoning given by the Supreme Court is that this behavior is not protected, constitutionally protected. So that just opens the door, and it's a message to Southerners across the country that they can proceed without fear of federal intervention. And as I say, what it means, it sets the stage for an abandonment of this field by the federal government until 1939, when the Civil Rights Unit is launched, and Frank Murphy, who would a Michigander who would later become a Supreme Court justice, is appointed by FDR to head up civil rights for the federal government.
Would you explain the particular role of Justice Joseph B. Bradley in underscoring the Jim Crow era?
Yeah, so it was Bradley who wrote the opinion in Cruikshank. He was at that point a lower appellate court judge, but his opinion was accepted when it got to the Supreme Court. Bradley was on the Supreme Court, but at that point, the judges also served in an appellate capacity right below the Supreme Court. And so it's Bradley's opinion in which he says, look, this is slavery. This is not a 13th Amendment problem. No one's in chains here. Slavery's over. So the 13th Amendment provides no protection. The 14th Amendment, which provides for equal protection, is not applicable either. There were no equal protection rights violated, nor is any other amendment at that time. Of course, the Second Amendment would also have been applicable because the African Americans were seeking to protect themselves, and everybody was armed on both sides of this conflict. So it's his opinion which pulls the teeth out from the 13th Amendment that becomes the basis for an understanding of the Civil War amendments 13, 14, and 15 as quite limited, as really a truncated approach to these amendments. 13 becomes basically useless to secure the rights of individuals to protect their African Americans to protect their lives and their property. 13 is after Cruikshank inapplicable to that.
You also write about a case in 1945, Screws versus United States, which defined the terms of federal engagement with racially motivated police cases for the next 40 years. What did it do?
So in the Screws is an interesting case, not just for its holding, but also because the facts were quite dramatic, which is really the only reason it ultimately reaches the Supreme Court. Just to briefly describe the facts that led to the opinion, Robert Hall is a recently returned soldier, a veteran who returns to his community in Georgia. He brings back with him a gun, which he had secured from his overseas travels, overseas military service, and the sheriff of that county, whose name is Screws, Sheriff Screws, decided that Negroes could not be armed in his county. And so he grabs the gun, or has the gun taken from Robert Hall, who then has the temerity to hire a lawyer and get an opinion from a grand jury ordering the sheriff to return the gun. The sheriff then trumps up a charge against Hall, which gives him the opportunity to go to his home, grab him in the middle of the night, and the sheriff and his deputies then take Hall to the courthouse where the jail is located, and the courthouse is the county, obviously the county courthouse. And there on the lawn, in the presence of all the neighbors who are listening and awakened by this event, they beat him to death with straps and various instruments. They just beat him and leave him leave him in a state where ultimately he dies from this beating. Now, obviously, the sheriff is prosecuted by federal authorities here, thereby the case Screws versus U.S. Starts as U.S. versus Screws. And it ultimately reaches the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court applies one of these two statutes that I mentioned, which is a criminal statute addressing unconstitutional criminal behavior by a public official, by a state actor. And the Supreme Court says in Screws that the sheriff can't be held responsible under this statute because it's not clear from the evidence that he intended to deprive Robert Hall, his victim, of a particular constitutional right. So the justices in Screws, they hypothesized that maybe the sheriff had a beef against Hall. Maybe he just didn't like Hall. Maybe this was a personal matter. We have no way of appreciating this as an effort to deprive Hall of his constitutional rights, and therefore the statute does not apply. It's a question, what the sheriff says, as the court says, a question of the intent of the sheriff here, the criminal who is the criminal defendant, and of course, intent is critically important in criminal cases.
So we're talking really about the structure, but it's really the personal cases that animate the stories in your book, By Hands Now Known. You begin with one of Ollie Hunter. Can you tell me Ollie Hunter's story?
I start with Ollie Hunter because it says a lot about vulnerability of women as well as men. Ollie Hunter was a woman in her senior years. She was, at that point, it would be considered senior. I don't know about today, but she's in her 60s. And the case comes to us by way of a letter that was written to the NAACP describing a killing in the small town of Donaldsonville, Georgia, in the 1940s. And the author of the letter doesn't give the name of the victim because he doesn't know it, but he says she went into a store on the main street and apparently picked up a can, which upset the store owner, who is the store clerk, who is a young white man in his 20s. And he follows her out of the store and beats her to death with an axe. And the letter writer seeks the support of the NAACP to uncover this case and to seek justice for the victim. And that's it. That's the only document in the file when we get it. We are able to identify who the victim is by matching up the time in the letter and the death certificates from Donaldsonville. And so that brings us to this woman. We get her death certificate. It obviously doesn't describe any kind of a violent incident, but from there we piece together who she was. And let me just add that we did ultimately end up with one other piece of evidence in the Ollie Hunter case. And it's a commentary on the through line in the book, because it was a letter from a relative of Ollie Hunter who was identified by our students and who is in jail in Florida. She's incarcerated. This letter comes to us in 2020. And she writes that, yes, this is her relative, and she'd like to help in any way she could to reconstruct her life. We weren't able fully to pursue that, but it suggests the ways, and in some ways, obviously there are serious disconnects, but it suggests the connection between the old Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow in some ways. So Ollie Hunter is basically invisibilized. She disappears. Her death is unremarkable in Donaldsonville. She just passes into history. And so I start the story just because I think it reveals how these cases emerged from very ordinary, everyday encounters between white people and Black people, and how lost they have been to history.
So was anything other than the relative that was uncovered, did Donaldsonville recognize Ollie Hunter's death once you told the story?
Not as far as we know.
So the thing that her case was one of a store, but so many of the individual cases that you write about happened on public transportation. And I wanted to first start off by having you explain the role of public transportation in daily life of African Americans in the South during that period of time.
As everybody knows, the buses were segregated, and they were the emblem of Jim Crow. Rosa Parks made that true. So these are public buses. People had to take them to work, to shop, to get to see relatives. And the control of the Jim Crow apparatus in the bus was left in the hands of bus drivers. So across the South, we see bus drivers who are armed. Why would a bus driver need a weapon? Because he has to impose the discipline of Jim Crow in the bus. And African Americans are protesting. They're resisting in 1,000 different ways, some well organized, and some not organized, some completely spontaneous. And so we have a number of cases in the archive where bus drivers have shot and killed passengers, or where bus drivers have called on the police who arrived quickly on the scene to discipline black riders who are resisting, and maybe they're just protecting. Maybe they're tired, as was famously Rosa Parks. Maybe they don't intend to have these symbols of protest. But for some reason, they're upsetting the apple cart, annoying the bus driver, out of place, and therefore subjected to this lethal violence. And we tell a number of these stories, and a number of them focus on soldiers, many of whom are traveling in the South for the first time. These are folks who are coming from areas where other elements of Jim Crow obviously still exists. New York City, you can't get a job. You can't, if you're African American, you can't get certain jobs, can't live in certain neighborhoods. But these more visible and humiliating forms of racism, the color line in the bus, are new to the soldiers who are traveling who are now traveling in these cities. And the buses are more crowded. Folks are. It's the wartime. People are, the cities are filling up with people from across the country. And so the hustle and bustle of public transportation is really enhanced. And the soldiers are coming into contact with Jim Crow in ways that are new to them, and therefore a number of them end up lethal victims of bus drivers or police.
So the soldiers arrived with the mistaken belief that their uniform and their service somehow changed the equation, but that was a deadly miscalculation for many.
It was, and oftentimes it was the very uniform itself that was offensive to either bus drivers or to police officers. We tell one story of a man in a small town, Summit, Georgia, who was out in uniform on July 4th with a friend, a female friend, and he's shaken down by a police officer. And he objects and he says, "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm sitting here having a drink with my friend, a beer with a friend." And he says to the police officer, "I'm not your man anymore. I'm Uncle Sam's man." And the officer continues to abuse him. He ends up at the end of an alley and then is shot to death. The man's name is Willie Davis. His mother spends the rest of her years fighting for justice in her son's case. She has two sons. They both go to the service. And this is a devastating loss for her. And obviously, the friend who was with him, to see this violence is obviously, it's not just the lethality, but also the trauma that people have to live with, because the violence is perpetrated, in full public view. Got another case out of Durham in which a soldier, name is Booker Spicely, protests being ordered to sit in the back of the bus. When he gets off the bus driver follows him off the bus and shoots him right there on the streets of Durham. Everybody on that bus sees that. The white travelers, the black travelers, the other soldiers, the white soldiers who are sitting in the front of the bus while Booker is ordered to sit in the back of the bus. So these are, these are events that spread. They're like Cujo. They just spread all over the place. Yes.
I also flagged the story of Private Henry Williams in 1942 in Mobile. Do you remember that story?
I do. So Henry is out of Mississippi, enlisted soldier in Mobile, Alabama, and is traveling back to his base. Gets on a bus. The bus driver, also from Mississippi, is talking to a neighboring bus driver or is having a conversation. And Williams is late to meet his curfew. And so he says to the bus driver, "Could you move on so I can meet my curfew?" And the bus driver is just insulted and incensed by this that he engages a heated conversation with Williams, who then grabs his laundry. He's done his laundry in Mobile, and chases him off the bus and shoots him to death right there. Now, that incident led to a protest movement in Mobile, Alabama, which ultimately successfully resulted in the disarming of bus drivers, not the desegregation of the buses. That wouldn't come until the 1950s, but certainly the disarming of the bus drivers.
When the Supreme
Court... It was a threatened boycott in that case led by the NAACP that resulted in the bus drivers being disarmed.
When the Supreme Court said segregated buses were no longer viable, did that end the violence?
That I can't say. Well, to the extent that it was enforced, it would have ended violence related to Jim Crow segregation on the buses. It certainly doesn't end the violence in these communities.
Sure.
And by the way, the buses are not desegregated, as we all well know, until the 1960s, really. So the Freedom Rides are really about desegregating public transportation across the 1950s and into the 1960s. We all remember the story of John Lewis, who was on a Freedom Ride, arrived at Anniston, Alabama, and was beaten within an inch of his life. That, I believe, was 1961.
So the white citizens who were witnesses to these kinds of incidents, there had to be people of good heart who would want to come, who were horrified by it. What prevented them in these communities from coming forward and insisting that some justice be done?
Well, in many cases, I don't know. I can't say many. Let me not begin counting here. But we uncover cases in which white citizens fought the system. So in one case out of Birmingham, a man who is a chauffeur for a family, chauffeur for a doctor and his wife, prominent family, is on his day off. He goes to the barbershop. He gets out of the barbershop after spending time with his buddies in the barbershop in Black area in Birmingham, and is shot down by a police officer on the street. And officer tells a story about how he was attacked by the victim, and the victim was drunk, et cetera, and so on. And the couple for whom he worked, first of all, the doctor did an autopsy establishing that the shooting took place in a way that refuted the self-defense story, and established that it was a cold blood shooting. And so he steps up to the plate, and his wife, also a prominent Birmingham citizen at the time, seeks to use her influence with the prosecutors in town to attest to the character of this fellow. The victim said he didn't drink, so he couldn't have been drunk, and she knew him well, as they say, like one of the family, is what people said about their household help. And so they know him well, and they try to get justice, but they are certainly unable in this case to break through the line of solidarity, in this case, led by Bull Connor and others in Birmingham. And that's not, that happens repeatedly in the archive in ways that obviously are discouraging for whites who might want to be allies during this period.
A couple of other aspects of the story. What was the role of the local media? Your students were able to find stories, but how were these kinds of incidents generally covered in the local mainstream press?
So by mainstream, I assume you mean the white press. So
yes, exactly.
There are two presses involved here. There's the black press, and the black press, the so-called black press, and then there's the so-called white press. So the black press are critically important in our ability to recover these stories, and that would be the Amsterdam News, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the newspaper. There was a newspaper out of Virginia and a newspaper out of North Carolina, and the Atlanta World, the Birmingham World. These are critically, and some are local, some are national. The national black press picked up these stories from their local contacts, and thereby created a form of a national community of resistance. And so some of these stories come out of the black press. Our students are also able to pick up the accounting in the white press, and obviously the white press are always assuming that the account given by public officials, and either the police or other public officials, is the right account. And this is also true today, that people get too much of their news about violent incidents that may involve the police from the police themselves, without appreciating that the police have a reason to distort an account, that this is not an impartial account of the event. So the white press are always there's always, in many cases in Birmingham, for example, there's a knife. The black man, whoever he may have been, always has a knife. Whereas the black press are telling a very, very different story. We have a lot of stories where people are killed in their homes. We have a lot of stories where people are killed because they have a disability and therefore are not, fully able to respond to perhaps a police inquiry. And so rather than, making further inquiries. They're shot to death, often over and over. So the disability rights movement will find a great deal of interesting history about the way the double liabilities that African Americans who also had disabilities faced. So yes, the press is critically important for our students, not only in being able to compare the way these stories were told, but also in their ability to recover stories. And oftentimes the stories are recovered in the Black press, but not in the white press. Let me just say one other thing about the Black press, which is the stories were oftentimes these stories are not carried in the local press at all. And Black communities would find out about them because folks who worked on the railroad, the Pullman porters, would travel from a place like Macomb, Mississippi, up to Chicago on the railroad. And they'd lay over in Chicago and they'd bring back the Chicago Defender. And the Chicago Defender might tell them about a killing in southwest Mississippi that they otherwise wouldn't have heard about. So the press is critical here.
You also earlier referenced the NAACP, and during the period that your research covered, the NAACP's size and importance grew, and Thurgood Marshall plays a role in many of the cases that you cite in the book, future Supreme Court Justice, obviously. How successful was the NAACP during this period in bringing some pressure to bear in these cases?
Thurgood Marshall, unlike a number of other organizations who were also active during this period, and there were a number of left organizations, socialist and communist organizations during the 1930s and 1940s, what the NAACP had that these other groups did not was the ear of the Justice Department. If Thurgood Marshall wrote to the Justice Department, he could be assured of a letter back, even if the letter was simply to say we're investigating or we're not investigating. He had the ear of the Justice Department, and before him, it was Charles Hamilton Houston in the 1930s, who is also writing to the Justice Department about these crimes. So the path at the NAACP office in Washington was a letter would come, as I said, so for example, from Donaldsonville up to Walter White. Walter White, who was the head of the NAA during this period of time, would pass the letter on to Marshall or to Robert Carter, who is a later NAA lawyer, and they would figure out how to respond, whether to contact the local branch or whether to contact justice directly or to do both. What the files reveal, and I think really for the first time, for legal scholars and for others interested in how our government worked and the role of organizations, advocacy organizations like the NAA, is what was going on in the DOJ in response to Marshall. So Marshall only has his file. Now we have the full DOJ file with the correspondence between lawyers at the DOJ, including lawyers situated in the South and those in the North. So in one case, for example, there's a guy, prosecutor in the South, his name is Parker, who is resistant to pursuing any cases. He's been burned once. He lost the case badly before a federal jury. He doesn't want to try any others. And the lawyers in Washington keep prodding him to move forward with these cases. And Marshall is prodding those lawyers in Washington to get the cases going. Some of these cases are out of Tuskegee. So Tuskegee, you have the university there. You have a pretty active African-American community. They're writing to Marshall. Marshall's writing to Washington. Nothing's going. And so what we have in the file is a letter or a memorandum from the DOJ Washington lawyer, essentially saying Parker will not move on anything. So it's the local DOJ lawyer who refuses to prosecute the cases. So now we can close the circle and fully appreciate why Marshall and the other advocates, lawyers and others, were effective or ineffective in getting federal intervention in these cases.
Two cities figure prominently by these hands now known. One is Birmingham, your hometown. The other is Detroit. What should we know about the roles they played in the story that you tell?
So let me start with Detroit. Detroit is a city with a deep history. I start in Detroit, 1920s. It's a city with a very, very deep history of African-American organizing and African-American liberatory efforts, going back to the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad runs through Detroit. Folks stop there. They gain succor and support in Detroit, but some of them also move on to other cities. They move on to Canada, for example. Move on to Canada. So Detroit is well positioned to support African Americans who are running from violence in the South. And so I picked 3 or 4 cases where African Americans are escaping lynch mobs in places like Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Those are my 3 cases: Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi. And they all end up in Black Bottom, Detroit, starting in the 1920s. I tell the story of a woman who is being prosecuted. She's a nurse. She's being prosecuted because she's been involved in an incident that resulted in the death of one of her patients who had sought an abortion. And she and the patient's boyfriend are both prosecuted. They are found not guilty, but then the Pensacola authorities start a new prosecution against her. She realizes she's got to get out of Dodge, and she does, and she ends up in Detroit. And so I tell her story, and then I also tell the story of a man who in the 1930s had to ran from, let me put it that way, from Louisiana, ends up in Detroit, and it's claimed that he shot and killed a police officer in Louisiana, in New Orleans, in the early 1930s. 10 years later, his extradition from Detroit is sought by the authorities. That's successful. 2 police officers from New Orleans come back. They take him back to New Orleans, and on the day of his arrival in New Orleans, those police officers shoot and kill him. So I tell these stories first of all, to describe the kind of lawyering that went on during this period, the kind of legal advocacy, mostly led by African-American lawyers in Detroit, the sophistication of their advocacy, and the nature of the support that was provided by the local Detroit community, and the ways in which these stories of escape and of escape from danger and from lynching began to knit together a national African-American community where those who had migrated or who had lived for many generations in Detroit found that there was something they could do to contribute to the protests and resistance in the places from which they had come.
You suggest that Detroit received 100,000 migrants during the Great Migration, many of them escaping the violence in the South. We only have about 10 minutes left. Our hour is really rapidly deteriorating here. And I mentioned Birmingham, and let me just keep it to one question because I want to move on to the final section of your book. And that is, Birmingham is your hometown. Your family, your parents were involved in the civil rights movement in the 1940s. Is this your story as well?
Well, it's my parents' story. I was a young child in Birmingham, and they left Birmingham and moved to New York City, where I was really raised. I was born in a segregated hospital in Birmingham, but ultimately grew up in New York. And I tell the stories about Birmingham because Birmingham is such a unique place. We know the Birmingham of the 1960s, but we don't really know. That's been well told by a number of authors, Carry Me Home, by Diane McWhorter, and others have told the Birmingham story. But we don't know this earlier story as well, notwithstanding the work of Robin Kelly and others to inform us. And so I seek to tell the story of the violence of the police and the deep seat of resistance provided by Birmingham communities.
You titled your project the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Program, and the last part of your book is about redress. You argue that restorative justice is necessary. You write, recognizing these victims and restoring justice for their families today is both possible and necessary. What does that look like?
So I leave it to the families to say what it looks like. What I will say is that we're in the moment of repair, reparations, redress. It's not just an American moment, it's an international moment. This is going on all over the world. Communities are looking back to appreciate the devastation of past wrongs, such as colonialism, in our case, slavery and Jim Crow. And so I argue that this particular set of victims, and I use the word victim intentionally here. Some would use the word survivors, victim survivors. They are known. We know who these families are. This is not ancient history. Not to say that slavery is ancient history, but this is our era. We talk about the great generation from World War II. We honor their service. We appreciate all that they did. So this is close to our time, and it's measurable. We can appreciate what these families lost, or we have the tools to measure what it is they lost, and we know who they are. And so all of the factors that would make it perhaps more difficult to institute and carry out a project of repair for an earlier period are absent here. And so I say this is a critical place to start our work of repair as a nation. And we've done it before with respect to World War II. The Civil Liberties Act signed by President Clinton, which recognized the horrors visited on the Japanese and Japanese American communities during World War II, was an example of the kind of recognition that should be enacted here.
We have about 5-6 minutes left. You have also been confirmed by the Senate as part of the 5-member federal Civil Rights Cold Case Review Board. What is the work that the review board does?
The review board the review board is not limited to the African American story. It's about civil rights cold cases that cross racial lines, where the civil rights of individuals were found to be violated, and where these cases have been remain in the files of the Justice Department and the FBI and in other files. Our job is to open up those files to the general public. There obviously are criteria that will guide our work. We're not trying to make available to the public files that discuss sensitive matters that affect foreign affairs or living individuals. But within the guidelines set forth in the statute, our job is to render these files publicly available as expeditiously as we can, so that these stories can be absorbed by the American public and a greater justice found wherever it may be found and however it may be accomplished.
A couple of closing questions. You spent your life's work immersed in the intersection of civil rights and the law. How do you feel about the state of things today?
Obviously, much work to be done. I'm neither an optimist or a pessimist. As a scholar, I just try to be a realist to describe where we are as a country. Obviously, deeply disturbed by the effort to close down libraries and in effect burn books and criminalize certain forms of teaching. When I was a young civil rights worker, we created the freedom schools because we knew our kids were being miseducated. Maybe it's a freedom school moment. It shouldn't have to be. Our public schools should be able to look at all of these issues pertaining to the ongoing African American freedom struggle in its reformist as well as in its radical dimensions, as well as the LGBT struggles, continuing struggles around the freedom and liberation of women in all of its aspects, and the ability of folks in the disability community to make their case and to experience all of the rights and privileges that we would hope and expect are to be available in a country like ours, which is not currently the case, but it's something that we all need to strive for and understand the intersectionality of our struggles.
What has the immersion in this work done for your reflections on human nature? We're
on the earth to control these horrific appetites, to demonize the other. That's why we're here. We're here to appreciate that those dehumanizing, invisibilizing, and violent behavior will surface. Will surface, and our job is to knock it down, knock it back, knock it down, and control it. That's why we have government. That's why we have a justice system. That's why we have community. That's why we care about each other. That's why we have religious communities. That's what this is all about. And that work is ongoing. And we want to get out of the dark spaces and find some light for all of us.
And in our last minute, explain the title, By Hands Now Known.
Back in the days that I talk about, coroners and others would often describe these incidents of violent murder with the term by hands unknown. Even lynchings, where thousands of people would gather in community to witness these events, they would ultimately be described as having been committed by hands unknown. Everybody knew who did it. Everybody knew who lit the match, fired the gun, strung up the individual, and yet the hands were unknown. And I argue here that in more ways than one, we understand now who those hands were. And they weren't just the people who lit the match, but they were also the judges, the lawyers, the coroners, the pathologists, all of whom at one point or another took an oath to serve justice, and many of them ended up doing exactly the opposite.
Legal scholar Margaret Burnham on book tour for the book By Hands Now Known. Thanks for joining us as you're on tour in Mississippi and for spending an hour with C-SPAN.
Thank you so much for having me. Greatly appreciate it and enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Q&A, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. And while you're there, please take a minute to rate and review us. You can also send us an email about Q&A at podcasts@c-span.org. Send me your questions, your comments, or ideas. Your feedback is welcome.